Welcome to this deep dive, and we're going to be looking at some really serious accusations against Vice President Sara Duterte. Those three impeachment complaints that were filed just this month.
That's right. And these complaints aren't just legal technicalities. They really get to the heart of Philippine politics. They raise a lot of questions about power accountability and, how much the public really trusts their elected officials.
Okay, so three complaints in a single month. That's got to be unusual, right?
Yeah, it's definitely not common. And the fact that all these complaints, were filed so close together, it makes you think that there's a real concerted effort here to challenge the vice president's actions.
Yeah, these documents, they're pretty dense. Where do we even begin?
Well, I think a good place to start is with an overview of each complaint, focusing on the core allegations. The first one really centers around these confidential funds, millions of pesos allocated to both the Office of the Vice President and the Department of Education, back when Vice President Duterte was the secretary. And the complainants allege that these funds were misused.
Oh, those mysterious confidential funds. Yeah, we're talking about a lot of money here.
Exactly. And because they're confidential, there's less scrutiny, of how they're used. The complainants, and this is a group of concerned citizens, allege that there's a pattern of questionable spending. For example, large sums were dispersed for, things like rewards and various goods. But the documentation was really vague, and that raised red flags for the Commission on Audit.
Right, the COA.
The COA, the government agency that's responsible for auditing how public funds are used.
Right, the COA.
Yeah.
And didn't something come up about receipts being signed with a fake name?
Yes, there were these receipts signed by a Mary Grace Piatos, and it seems like this name is linked to a restaurant and snack brand, but it doesn't show up in the Philippine Statistics Authority database. And then there were also some receipts showing identical names receiving payments from both the Office of the Vice President and the Department of Education on the same day.
That does seem odd. What about the vice president's response to these allegations? How did she defend herself?
Well, during the budget hearings, she chose not to answer questions directly, stating that she would leave it up to the House to decide about the budget and her supporters. They argued that she was just respecting the legislative process and not trying to, exert undue influence.
So she's basically saying it's up to the House to decide how the budget's allocated, not her place to defend it line by line. Interesting approach.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that, she hasn't been found guilty of anything. These are just allegations at this point, and she's presumed innocent until proven otherwise.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
So that's the first complaint, possible misuse of confidential funds and lack of transparency. What about the second one?
Okay, so the second complaint focuses on her relationship with Congress, specifically alleging that she disregarded their oversight, particularly during budget hearings and investigations.
So they're saying that she wasn't cooperating with the House of Representatives.
Essentially, yes. The complainants point to the fact that she repeatedly declined to answer questions about those confidential funds, during hearings, even when the House pressed for clarification. She was also absent from several hearings, both for the Office of the Vice President and the Department of Education, and the complainants say that this shows a lack of respect for their authority.
I see. So from her side, maybe she felt like the House was overstepping its bounds, trying to micromanage how she was running things.
That's a possible interpretation.
Yeah.
Her supporters might argue that she was just trying to maintain, that separation of powers between the executive branch, which she's a part of, and the legislative branch, which is the House of Representatives.
Okay, so it's like a tug of war between the different branches of government.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And this tension, it really comes to a head in this second complaint. You see, it goes beyond just her not answering questions. She also tried to prevent Congress from getting access to certain documents from the COA.
Wait, back up a second. Why would she even try to block those documents? What's the strategy there?
Well, her chief of staff actually wrote a letter to the COA chairman advising him not to comply with the subpoena from Congress for those audit documents. The argument was that handing over those documents would violate the principle of separation of powers and due process.
So they're arguing that Congress demanding these documents from the COA upsets the balance of power between the different branches of government.
Exactly. It's a complex legal argument, but basically they're saying that Congress was overreaching its authority.
And then things escalated even further at the House of Representatives building, right?
That's right. Her chief of staff was found in contempt and detained by the House Vice President Duterte. Went to the House building to be with her, even holding a press conference there.
Okay, so that move, entering the House after her chief of staff's detainment, it really highlights how personally invested she seems to be in this whole situation, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And during that press conference, she made some pretty strong remarks about President Marcos Jr., the First Lady, and House Speaker Ramal Dez, who you'll remember had ordered her chief of staff detained.
Wow, so this second complaint isn't just about alleged misuse of funds. It's about a potential clash of personalities and a struggle for power between the vice president and the House of Representatives.
Exactly. And it raises some important questions about the limits of executive power and the importance of legislative oversight in a democracy.
Okay, so we've got two complaints down, possible misuse of funds, and a power struggle with Congress. What about this third complaint? What's that all about?
All right, this one takes things in a more specific direction. It focuses on the alleged misappropriation of 125 million pesos from the Office of the Vice President's confidential funds back in December 2022.
Okay, this is where things get interesting. Break this down for me. What exactly are they accusing her of doing?
The complaint alleges that she funneled these funds to people who don't exist, using
Yeah.
fake receipts. It even claims that she tried to cover up this misappropriation by telling staff to create false documentation.
Wow, that's a serious accusation. Is there any evidence to support that?
Well, the complainants point to inconsistencies in the documentation, like that Mary Grace Piatto signature we talked about earlier, as well as the impossibly short time frames, in which some of these disbursements supposedly took place.
So they're building a case based on paper trail that doesn't quite add up.
Exactly. They're saying that the way these funds were handled just doesn't make sense, and that the only logical explanation is that there was an attempt to hide something.
And remember, this is all on top of those previous complaints about a possible pattern of questionable spending, dating back to her time at the Department of Education.
Right. The complainants argue that this third complaint isn't just an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger pattern of behavior.
But what about her side of the story? How does she explain all of this?
Well, she hasn't directly addressed the specifics of this third complaint yet, but her supporters point to her long history of public service and her dedication to helping the Filipino people. They argue that it's just not in her character to engage in the kind of corrupt activities that she's being accused of.
So they're basically saying that her reputation speaks for itself.
Yes. And they emphasize that she has a right to due process and that she's presumed innocent until proven guilty.
That's an important point to remember. Okay, so we've got these three pretty serious accusations against the vice president. Where do things go from here? What are the next steps in this whole process?
Well, now the House of Representatives has to decide if they want to move forward with impeachment proceedings, and if they vote in favor, then the Senate would hold a trial to determine whether she should be removed from office.
And that's a big if, right? It's not easy to impeach and convict a high-ranking official.
Definitely not a slam dunk. The political stakes are incredibly high, and there's a lot of uncertainty about how this is all going to play out.
Thinking about all of this, it really makes me wonder about the impact this is having on the Filipino people. I mean, these are serious allegations against someone they elected to represent them.
Absolutely. These impeachment complaints have really shaken things up in Philippine politics, and it's a reminder that public trust is fragile, and that even those in the highest positions of power are not above scrutiny.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground just in this first look at the complaints.
Yeah.
But we're just getting started. There's so much more to unpack here.
One of the things that's really stood out to me about these complaints is that they don't just focus on the vice president's actions. They also raise questions about the people she surrounds herself with and the level of influence they might have.
Yeah, like that whole thing with the Department of Education and the military certifications. That was pretty wild.
Right. Remember the Commission on Audit, the COA? They questioned 15.54 million pesos that the Department of Education had supposedly spent on rewards for informants. And to justify this spending, the Department of Education submitted certifications from several officers in the armed forces of the Philippines. The AFP saying that this money went to youth leadership seminars. But get this.
Those military officers later testified that the Army completely funded those seminars, not the Department of Education.
Exactly. And they claimed they had no idea that their certifications would be used to justify these confidential fund expenditures from the Department of Education.
So it sounds like someone was trying to create a paper trail that didn't actually match reality. And that raises the question, how much did the vice president know about this?
That's a key question. Was this a case of subordinates acting on their own, or was their direction coming from the top? Investigators will have to try to piece together who knew what and when.
And there's another detail from the third complaint that also makes you wonder about the role of subordinates. This one involves the 125 million pesos that was supposedly misappropriated in December 2022. This complaint goes into a lot of detail about how the Office of the Vice President's Special Dispersing Officer supposedly made a bunch of cash deliveries to different people, all using those confidential funds.
Yes. The complaint even includes a whole list of dates, recipients, and amounts, all documented with these acknowledgement receipts. But here's the catch. The complainants claim that a lot of these receipts were fabricated, and the people named as recipients don't even exist.
Wait, they're saying these receipts are forgeries.
That's what they're alleging.
Right.
They point to things like the Mary Grace Piatto signature, which the Philippine Statistics Authority confirmed doesn't belong to any real person, as evidence that something fishy is going on.
And just to be clear, the Philippine Statistics Authority, or PSA, is basically the official record keeper for births, deaths, marriages, that sort of thing. So if they say someone doesn't exist, that's pretty damning, right?
It definitely raises serious questions, but it gets even more complicated. The Special Dispersing Officer actually testified that he didn't make those cash deliveries himself.
Hold on. If he didn't deliver the money, then who did?
He claims that he gave the entire 125 million pesos in cash to a Colonel Dennis Nolasco, who was a military aide assigned to the Office of the Vice President at the time.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Millions of pesos in cash just handed over to someone else without any further oversight.
Really?
That's what he claims. And he says he did it on the instructions of Vice President Duterte herself.
Okay, now that's a bombshell. If that's true, it paints a very different picture of how these funds were handled. It also makes you wonder about the judgment of those involved. I mean, handing over that much cash with seemingly no accountability, that just seems incredibly risky.
It definitely raises red flags. But we have to be careful not to jump to conclusions. We only have one side of the story so far. It's possible there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of this.
Right. Innocent until proven guilty. But let's zoom out for a moment. We've been diving deep into the specifics of these complaints, but what's the overall goal here? What are the complainants actually hoping to achieve? Ultimately, they want Vice President Duterte removed from office. They argue that her actions, whether they were directly related to the alleged misuse of funds or her handling of the investigations, constitute a betrayal of public trust, and that under the Philippine Constitution is grounds for impeachment.
Okay, remind me what betrayal of public trust actually means in this context. It sounds pretty serious.
Well, the Philippine Supreme Court has interpreted betrayal of public trust as actions that might not be criminal offenses, but still show a serious lack of faithfulness in carrying out the duties of public office. It's a pretty broad definition, and it includes things like abuse of power, extreme negligence, and blatant favoritism that hurts the public interest.
So basically they're saying that even if her actions aren't technically crimes,
Yeah.
they still show she's not fit to be vice president.
Exactly. They're saying she's abused the power and trust that come with her position. And to be fair, this isn't the first time she's faced scrutiny over her use of confidential funds.
Oh, you mean back when she was the Secretary of Education?
Yes. During her time at the Department of Education, she requested and received 150 million pesos in confidential funds. And the COA later questioned a significant portion of those funds, too, because there wasn't enough documentation to justify how they were spent.
So you're saying there's a pattern here?
Well, at least a history of questions being raised about her management of confidential funds.
Wow.
Now, whether that's enough to prove a betrayal of public trust is a whole other question, and one that the House and potentially the Senate will have to grapple with.
Okay, let's say the House does decide to move forward with impeachment.
Yeah.
What would be the potential consequences for the vice president? I mean, beyond just being removed from office.
If she were convicted in a Senate trial, she wouldn't just be removed from office, she'd also be permanently banned from holding any public office in the future. That would be a huge blow to her political career, especially considering her family's long history in Philippine politics.
Wow, so the stakes are really high here.
Yeah.
It's not just her current position on the line. It's her entire future in politics.
Exactly. And the impact wouldn't just be on her personally. It could also have major ramifications for the stability of the entire Philippine government.
You know, all of this really makes you think about the immense responsibility that comes with holding public office. Every decision, every action has the potential to have huge consequences, not just for the person making the decision, but for the entire country.
That's a really important point. These impeachment complaints are a stark reminder that power must be exercised responsibly and ethically, and that transparency and accountability are crucial to maintaining public trust.
Okay, so we've looked at these three complaints in detail. We've talked about the allegations of misusing funds, disregarding congressional oversight, and potentially obstructing investigations. We've also highlighted her defense, refusing to answer questions during hearings, claiming she was acting in good faith, and arguing that her words have been twisted. But there's one more aspect of these complaints we need to discuss, and it's potentially the most explosive of all.
You're talking about the allegation that she was plotting to assassinate President Marcos Jr.? That's a serious accusation and adds a whole new dimension to this story. It's not just about financial misconduct anymore. It's about national security and the potential for
Yeah,
violence.
that's the one. To be honest, when I first heard about it, I was completely floored. It's hard to believe that something like that could even be possible.
It's certainly a shocking allegation, and it's one that we need to examine very carefully. So let's dive into the details and see what the evidence has to say.
Okay, let's do it. This is where things get really intense.
This third complaint, it really hinges on that late-night press conference Vice President Duterte held inside the House of Representatives building. You remember it was right after her chief of staff was found in contempt.
Right, she went to be with her chief of staff, even bypassing security to get to her,
Hmm,
which, kind of speaks to the intensity of the situation.
exactly. Now, during this press conference, she made some remarks that, some people interpreted as threats against the president and others.
Give me some examples. What did she actually say?
Well, she talked about ensuring her chief of staff's safety, even suggesting, that there might be retaliation if something happened to her. She also had some pretty harsh words for the president and the House Speaker, questioning their leadership and integrity.
Okay, but is that enough to accuse someone of plotting an assassination? I mean, couldn't you just chalk that up to anger and frustration, in a high-pressure moment?
Well, that's where things get a little murky. The complainants go a step further, alleging that Vice President Duterte had actually hired an assassin and given specific instructions to carry out these killings, if anything happened to her.
Whoa, okay. Now, that's a serious claim.
Hmm.
What evidence do they present to back that up?
They cite eyewitness accounts from people who were at the press conference claiming that, Vice President Duterte explicitly stated that she'd arranged for these killings.
Hmm.
They also point to her history of, strong, sometimes confrontational rhetoric, arguing that it shows a tendency for, impulsive, potentially dangerous statements.
But surely the vice president's side is pushing back against these allegations, right?
Absolutely. They're saying her words were taken out of context and that she never intended to threaten anyone's life. They maintain that, she was simply expressing loyalty to her chief of staff and venting frustration, at the House leadership.
So it boils down to interpretation. What did Vice President Duterte actually mean? Were these legitimate threats? That's a tough one.
It really is. And it's something that investigators and potentially the Senate will have to wrestle with.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation. On one hand, you have incredibly serious accusations,
Mm.
a potential plot to assassinate the president, which obviously can't be ignored.
And on the other hand, you have the vice president's right to due process and the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. We can't just jump to conclusions based on, interpretations of heated statements made in a stressful situation.
It makes you think about the power of words and how quickly things can spiral out of control.
It really underscores the importance of responsible leadership. When you're in a position of power, your words carry weight. People listen and they react sometimes in unpredictable ways.
Yeah, this must have put a real strain on the relationship between Vice President Duterte and President Marcos Jr.
No doubt. It's hard to imagine, them governing effectively together with this kind of cloud of suspicion hanging over them.
So where do we go from here?
Yeah.
What are the potential outcomes of this third impeachment complaint?
Like with the others, it's up to the House of Representatives to decide whether or not they want to move forward with impeachment proceedings. And if they do, the Senate will hold a trial.
And if she's convicted?
Conviction would mean removal from office and potentially being barred from ever holding public office again. The impact would be enormous, both for her political career and for the stability of the Philippine government.
Wow, we've explored a lot in this deep dive. 3 separate impeachment complaints. Allegations of misusing funds, ignoring congressional oversight, potentially hindering investigations, and even this incredibly serious allegation of plotting to assassinate the president. And we've looked at the vice president's defenses. And it's really important to remember that she's presumed innocent until proven guilty.
These complaints, they offer a real glimpse into how the Philippine government works, exposing those tensions and complexities that often exist, beneath the surface.
What happens next is anyone's guess. But one thing's for sure, these events have permanently changed the political landscape in the Philippines.
It's a reminder that we as citizens need to stay informed and engage. Our democracy depends on it.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a heavy one, but hopefully you've gained some valuable insights into this complex and evolving situation. We'll continue to follow the story closely and keep you updated on any major developments.